Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad that you can be with me today, and I am very excited about this new series of episodes that we're going to begin today that I've entitled Understanding Your Story. And I'm going to get into that here in just a moment. But before I do, I thought I'd share with you guys a letter that I received recently from a man who actually lives in another country, and he's been listening to the podcast. And he says here, "Hi, Tony. Good news. God has worked a major miracle in my marriage and my life. During December, my wife agreed to join me and one of our sons on a holiday for 2 weeks doing a road trip. We spent quite a lot of time in each other's company, and by the end of the holiday, she asked me to move back in with her and the kids at home. This came after I prayed nonstop for almost 160 days for her, and also after being free from porn and masturbation for 160 days. This is the same wife who told me her emotions for me were dead, that she would never in her life touch me again, and that we would never be lovers again, that I should move out of the house, and that she wanted to get a divorce. You were right. We serve a God that specializes in bringing things to life that used to be dead. We have moved in together and have agreed to do weekly counseling sessions with our therapist. All is not 100%, but we're committed to fix it and take things slow. All glory to the Lord our God. I'm a work in progress, and I'm daily working on my relationship with Jesus and my fight to keep my purity. If you have any resources and information that I or we can use going forward to help us rebuild our marriage, I will appreciate it. I also want to thank you for the Power of Purity podcast and videos. Without those, and obviously the Lord's hand, I would not have been able to get free." Well, praise be to God. That letter is incredibly encouraging to me, and I hope it's encouraging to you also. And the letter affirms to me at least a couple things, you guys. I want to share just a couple observations. And the first one is just this, that it is possible for a man to change his heart, his life, and the way he's managing his sexual gift. This man ran into tragedy and difficulty and heartbreak around his relationship with his wife and his family because of his problem with sex, basically, his issue with pornography, that his wife got so tired of, she finally separated from him. And it was about that time that he found the Power of Purity podcast and began to listen, and God used it to touch his heart and life and to help him. He recommitted himself to God, and he recommitted his sexual gift to God and purpose to honor God with the expression of his sexual gift and to honor his wife, and he began to walk it out, and months began to pass, and you guys heard the letter. It's just like a miracle, as this man says. God has worked a major miracle in my marriage and my life. So I just feel like this letter is living proof that it is possible for a man to make these changes in his life. And it is possible, my second observation, for God to heal a deeply wounded and broken marriage relationship. And of course, you guys have heard my story. Sherry and I are living proof, and I believe that this couple is becoming living proof that, as the man says in his letter, God can bring something back to life that used to be dead, which of course is the template of the gospel itself. Christ died, Christ buried, Christ resurrected. The template of the gospel teaches us that God has the ability to take something that used to be dead, the body of Jesus. Jesus was dead, and he rose from the grave. He came back to life. God can bring back to life something that used to be dead. My marriage was dead. My marriage was hopeless. My marriage was doomed. We were in such a dark, horrible, terrible, broken place. It was unbelievable. And yet, by God's grace and mercy and healing and redemption, we sought to follow God's redemptive path for our lives. And God gave Sherry and I a miracle, and He breathed life back into our marriage. And He's doing this for this couple that lives in another country. So I just wanted to share this letter with you guys in the hope that it would inspire you and encourage you to stay on this path of journey. You've got work to do with God. Maybe you've got work to do in your marriage. But if you follow the healing path that God has intended, I promise you that as you continue to do your thing, that God is going to honor that, and God's going to do His thing, and you might just be amazed at what God can do in your heart, in your life, in your sexuality, and in your marriage. So praise be to God. And so if you're struggling with any of these things, just keep moving forward, and I trust and pray and believe that God is going to work deeply and profoundly in your heart, your life, your situation, and bring about His healing and redemption, just like He's done for me and just like He's doing for this man. So praise be to God. And I just want to say that the man who wrote this letter, when I read it, you knew that it was your letter, presumably if you're listening to the podcast. So I just want to say, praise God, brother. I rejoice with you. I give thanks. You're in my heart. I pray for you and your wife and your situation. Thank you for the letter. It's very encouraging to me, and I'm so grateful for what God's doing in your heart and life. So I just rejoice with you. Praise be to God. And with that being said, you guys, I'll just go ahead and jump into our episode today, and I'm starting a new series of episodes that I'm entitling Understanding Your Story, or I might say understanding the story of your life. And I think that this is going to be a really important series of episodes. And let me just say a couple things about it in the way of introduction. I've actually been working on an outline for this series of episodes for, I think, at least a couple months, and it turned out to be a lot longer than I expected. My notes and my outline are actually 76 pages long. So I have no idea how many episodes this is going to turn into. As you know, I try to keep the episodes at about 30 minutes each. So we'll see how many episodes this particular series turns into, Understanding Your Story. And I actually have 16 different principles that I'm going to be sharing with you as we work our way through these 16 principles. 16 principles of understanding the story of your life. And before we get into principle 1, let me just share a couple thoughts with you. And I'll just say, guys, that this concept of story, I believe, is incredibly important. And it's actually at the very epicenter of kind of my construct and framework of life and of God and of spirituality and the way God works in people's hearts and lives, and just kind of the way that I approach counseling and the way that I approach ministry. I think it's incredibly important that people understand the story of their life. And many of you might know that I pastor a church in St. Charles, Missouri called the Outpost Church. And we started the church about 6 or 7 years ago. But before we started the church, I was leading kind of a Bible study group that met every Friday night. And the name of the group was Stories. And we had about 20 to 30 different people coming in and out of this group, and we were meeting every week. And the purpose of the group was along the lines of these episodes here in this title, Understanding Your Story, because I was seeing and learning and developing this construct of story, and that God's healing journey for our lives is going to have something to do with us understanding the story of our life and letting God into our stories and letting God do what He wants to do about the stories of our lives so we can experience the healing and the redemption of God. And also, many of you know that before that, I wrote a book, my first book, where I share the testimony of my life around the sexual healing of my life. And the title of that book is Stories. The subtitle is The Redemption of One Man's Wounded Sexuality. And if you might be interested in that book, it's available on the Power of Purity website. But I named the book Stories because, again, this concept of stories was becoming really impressed upon me, I think, from God, and becoming kind of the framework in which I was understanding the healing process and how I think God wanted me to approach ministry. So when I wrote that book, Stories, there's actually 40 chapters in the book, and all it is a series of 40 stories from my life. Actually, I wrote 39 stories, and then I invited my wife to write the very last chapter, chapter 40, and it's entitled Sherry's Voice. But it's a series of 39 stories from my life in sequence, and these stories kind of follow the sexual journey or the sexual trajectory of my life. And in that book, there's kind of before and after. I picture, if you can imagine, a set of steps descending down, 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 kind of into this dark dungeon, this place of captivity and darkness and bondage, and a place that you really wouldn't want to be. So the first half of the book I call the descending journey into bondage. And I tell this sequence of stories about how my sexuality was unfolding through my childhood and my adolescence. I found my dad's pornography. I was sexually abused by older women. I discovered masturbation, and kind of this series of stories that were unfolding in my life that were bringing me kind of down into a dark place, a place of sexual bondage or captivity or addiction. But then the second half of the book I call the ascending journey to freedom. And now picture another set of steps from the dark place, the dungeon, only coming up, 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 up toward the light, coming out of the darkness into the light. And so that's what the book is. It's the story of my sexual journey, but it's a sequence of stories. So I just believe, guys, that we all have stories. Our lives revolve around this concept of story. And that's what this series of episodes is going to be about, understanding your story. And let me just say this before I get into principle one. If you're listening to this podcast and you're a man who's been struggling with the issue of sex in your life, whatever it might look like for you, maybe you struggle with internet pornography, your wife doesn't know about it, you're a Christian man, you're doing these things in violation of your own conscience, you know God doesn't want you to be doing these things, and yet you do them anyway. Maybe you're acting out. Maybe you are involved in an adulterous affair. Maybe you go to strip clubs. Maybe you have sexualized chats on the internet. Maybe you get sexualized massages. I recently was speaking with a man who had an issue where he was going to massage parlors and doing things that he should not have been doing. So whatever your acting out looks like, my premise, you guys, is that I would advocate that who you are as a sexual person, who you became as a sexual person, is rooted, it's actually rooted in the stories of your life. And I would say this, if you want to understand who a person is, understand their stories, because the answer is always in their story. When you look back at my life and my journey and you understand these 39 stories from my life, if you looked at the stories in sequence, kind of like dominoes, it would make perfect sense to you how and why I came to the place where I had a sexual addiction. You know, part of my ministry, you guys, is that we go into the prisons in the state of Missouri, and I've said to people in the prison when we go to speak there and minister to the inmates, I've stood in front and said, I don't know most of you. I don't even know most of your names. I don't know anything about your life, but I do know one outstanding fact about you, and that is that you are incarcerated at WERDCC in Missouri, or you're incarcerated in Vandalia, Missouri, or you're incarcerated at Bowling Green, Missouri. But let me just say it this way. If I had the opportunity to sit down with any one of these inmates and spend an hour with them, or 2 hours with them, or several counseling sessions with them, and just like you would open up a trunk and begin to take things out of the trunk, if we could open up this person's life and just begin to take the stories of their life out of this trunk. Oh, here's an interesting story. Look at this. You smoked marijuana the first time when you were 12 years old. Oh, here's an interesting story. Look at this. You had sex for the first time when you were 9 years old. Are you kidding me, with your babysitter? Oh, here's an interesting story. This is the time some boys took you in the woods and taught you how to masturbate. Oh, here's another interesting story. If we just began to unpack the trunk of this person's life and take out their stories and begin to line up the stories of their life, I would advocate, you see, that we would understand how this person came to the place where they were eventually incarcerated in the state of Missouri. Of course you ended up in prison, because look at how this story led to this story, which 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 led to this story, just like dominoes, which led you to be incarcerated. So to understand who a person is, understand the stories of their life. So for so many years, myself as a Christian man, you see, I didn't understand why I struggled so much with this issue of sex. I didn't understand, why can't I get this under control? Why do I keep acting out sexually? Why do I keep doing these things that I know that God doesn't want me to do, that are dishonoring to God? I know that I shouldn't do them. And then after I do them, I feel guilty and I feel shame and I feel lousy. It's like, Tony, what's wrong with you? And I didn't understand what was wrong with me. And I believe that what happened is that through my therapeutic process, a very key part of this healing journey had to do with me coming to understand the stories of my life. And I believe now, as a minister, as a pastor, as a counselor, that a primary part of my job when I'm trying to help people, especially in the therapeutic process, is we typically begin to unpack a person's story and we try to help a person understand the story of their own life. And I've come to the place where I believe that most people do not understand the story of their own life. They might understand individual stories, things that happened, events that happened, historical events like my mom and dad got divorced when I was 7. We moved from Cincinnati when I was 9. I smoked marijuana the first time when I was 10. I had sex for the first time when I was 14. My brother was killed in the car accident when I was 16 years old. So we might be able to identify historical events and different stories from our life, but we don't necessarily understand how those stories have worked together to create kind of a trajectory in our life that brought us to today, that basically brought us to be the person that we are today. Because I would advocate that every person is essentially the sum total of the accumulation of the stories of their life. And you see, the fact is that I had all these stories in my past, in my history, around the issue of sex, these stories of darkness, these stories of bondage and sin and failure and hurt and pain and shame. And these stories were incredibly powerful. And you see, as these stories around who Tony was sexually and who I was becoming sexually, as there was an accumulation of these stories, it began to create a trajectory in my life who I was becoming as a sexual person. And so, of course, just like the person ended up in prison because of the accumulation of their stories, I myself ended up in a kind of metaphorical, invisible, sexual kind of prison, sexual addiction, a Christian man with this problem with sex, because of the trajectory of the accumulation of the stories of my life. So if you're interested in finding God's healing for your life, God's redemption, if you're interested in changing who you are as a sexual person, I believe this concept of story is incredibly important, and it's very important for you to begin to understand the stories of your life. And in this introduction that I'm giving right now, really that's turning out to be longer than I expected, but I'm just kind of sitting here and I'm just thinking out loud and talking out loud. And I'm actually touching on some of the principles that we're going to be going through as these episodes unfold, these 16 principles. But what I want to say, guys, is just this idea that there's incredible power in people's stories, whether they know it or not. And in our stories, you see, there's these things that live and they hold power and they're very significant. There's darkness in my stories. There's pain in my stories. There's hurt in my stories and confusion. And there's bondage and chains that came on my soul in my stories. So I believe that God's healing journey is going to have something to do with learning to cooperate with God and actually turning to face the story of my life and moving into my stories. And I'm going to show you guys how to do that in this upcoming series of episodes. But I move into the stories of my life, but here's a key. I do it with God at my side. And I believe that what God wants to do is He wants to bring His light, the light of Christ, into the darkest place of my stories. He wants to bring His healing into the most wounded places of my stories. He wants to bring His peace into the most tormented places of my stories. And it's as I learn to cooperate with God, and I let God and I let Christ into the stories of my life. You see, I take this journey into my stories. Then Jesus is able to do something in my stories. He's able to rearrange, like you would go in a house and rearrange the furniture. God is able to do something significant when we let Him into our stories and we let God do what God wants to do in the stories of our life. So just in the way of introduction, I'm talking out loud, you guys. I'm just trying to share my heart with you and this concept that I believe story is so important. It's at the epicenter of what's happening in our life. It's at the epicenter of who you've become. I promise you, it's at the epicenter. It explains perfectly why you are the sexual man today that you are. If I could sit down with you for an hour or two and just start talking to you and pulling stories out of your life and going like on this journey with you through your life and identifying stories, we would begin to identify strategic stories of your life. And we could begin to line those stories up like dominoes. And you know what? Your life story would begin to make sense. You would make sense. It would make sense to me. Oh, no wonder you're a man who struggles with internet porn. No wonder you can't say no to temptation, because look at this, look at this, look at this that happened to you. Look how this followed that, and look how this followed that. And so we see ourselves, you see, we understand ourselves as we understand the stories of our life. So to experience God's deep healing and redemption in our hearts, our lives, in our situation, even in our sexual selves, it's going to have something to do with understanding the story of your life. And that's why I've entitled this particular series of episodes, Understanding Your Story. And as I mentioned before, I've got 16 principles that we're going to work through. And so, with that being said, in the way of introduction, let's go ahead and jump into principle number 1, which is this. Every person's life is made up of many different stories. And in view of this first principle, you guys, I want to start with a metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle. So imagine this. You know what a jigsaw puzzle is, right? I don't know the last time that you did them. I'm not sure that I'm too crazy about jigsaw puzzles because they're pretty tedious and they take a lot of work. But anyway, I've never really been too good at jigsaw puzzles. But imagine that you open the box, and let's just say that this is a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle, and you dump it out on the table, and do you know what you have at this point? you've got a big mess, right? It doesn't make sense because none of these pieces go together. They're all piled up. This piece has a little bit of yellow on it, and I see this piece has a little bit of green on it, and this one looks blue. It looks like it might be the sky, and this one looks like it might go with a lake, and this, I think, is going to go in the trees. This one has a little red in it. So each individual piece of the puzzle, it doesn't make much sense by itself, right? And it's only as you begin to assemble the pieces of the puzzle together, begin to hook them together, and then add more pieces and more pieces and more pieces. And what happens eventually, if you stay at it, and if you can assemble the pieces of the puzzle together, a picture begins to emerge, and the picture makes sense. You see, you can see how all those pieces fit together to make the picture, the overall picture, what it is. And I think this is a great metaphor of every person's life. Principle 1, every person's life is made up of many different stories. So in much the same way, the overall picture of each person's life, your life and my life, consists of all the different stories of their life. Each individual story from my life, each individual story from your life is like a piece of the puzzle. And when you begin to put all those stories together, an overall picture of who you are as a person begins to emerge. And can you imagine how many stories there are in every person's life? In the metaphor I just gave of the jigsaw puzzle, I said, imagine a puzzle with 500 pieces. And that'd be a pretty big puzzle, right? 500 pieces. But did you know that most people's lives consist of way more than 500 stories? And of course, the longer a person lives their life, the more stories they're going to accumulate in their experience, right? So a person who lives to be 90 years old will end up accumulating way more stories in their life than a person who only lives to be 30 years old. So what are some examples of these stories? And I'm just going to read a little list here that I put together pretty quick. And every example that I'm going to read is a true story from my life, Tony Ingrassia. So here's examples of stories or pieces of the puzzle. The time I was playing corkball in the backyard and I swung the bat and I hit my sister in the head. Or the story of the time I saw the ocean for the very first time. Or the time I rode in the back seat of the station wagon and I threw up when I was a kid. The time I got in trouble for throwing an aluminum pie pan in front of the car and my dad punished me, let's just say, severely. The story of the first girl that I really had a crush on when she told me that she liked me, but only as a friend. The story of me killing my first deer when I was 13 years old. The story of the time my dad hit me because I put my feet on the couch. The story of the time my dad brought home our favorite beagle, Queenie, and she was dead because they went rabbit hunting and another guy accidentally shot Queenie while they were rabbit hunting. The story of me breaking my collarbone when I fell off the lava rocks in the neighbor's front yard. Then there's the time we went trout fishing on vacation. There's the time my dad's best friend was killed in the car accident, or the time my dad's cousin was killed in the car accident. There's the story of my grandma and grandpa fighting and her saying that grandpa was trying to push her out of the car while they were going down the highway, and him saying that he was trying to keep her in the car from jumping out while they were going down the highway. Then there's the story of going up in the arch for the first time. The story of my first job selling the DuQuoin Evening Call newspaper at the DuQuoin State Fair when I was 12 years old. The story of me being elected student body president my senior year in Bible college. Then there's the story of me falling in love with Sherry while we were playing catch with a softball at St. Ferdinand Park. And so, guys, you get the idea. On and on and on and on it goes. Can you imagine how many stories there are in each person's life? And one thing's for sure, and that is that every person's life is made up of many different stories, including me and including you. and that who a person is and who a person has become is predicated upon the sum total of the accumulation of the stories of their life. And if I had to pick a proof text for this first principle, you guys, every person's life is made up of many different stories, I thought of the passage from John chapter 4 when Jesus meets the woman at the well. And you're probably familiar with the story, but in verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." Verse 17, "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I perceive that you are a prophet." And my primary observation from this passage, you guys, is this. Isn't it interesting that Jesus knew the story of this woman's life? Somehow he knew her story. And he knew how her story had influenced the woman that she became. And as Jesus, in a sense, acknowledges her story, and he enters her story with her, not to judge her or condemn her, but to woo her and call her and help her, she's deeply touched, and she feels seen, and she feels known, and she feels understood. Because she leaves her water jug at the well, she rushes back to the village to tell the people. And in verse 29, she tells the people in the village, "Come and see a man who told me everything that I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" So we see, as Principle 1 states, that every person's life is made up of many different stories. And guys, we're coming to the close of this episode. I see I'm out of time, but let me just close by saying this. I just think it's kind of awesome, and I feel touched by the realization and the understanding and the belief that Jesus knows the story of my life. And Jesus knows the story of your life, just like he knew this woman's story. He said, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man that you're living with now is not your husband." And I don't know about you, but it might feel kind of scary to realize that God knows your story. God knows my story. God knows it all, you guys. In the same way that we can look through a clear sheet of glass, God sees through our life. God knows every single thing. He knows our top 10 list. He knows every single thing we've ever done wrong, every sin, every thought, every choice, every decision. He knows every bad thing that's ever happened to us. God knows the story of our life. And as we've learned in this first principle, every person's life is made up of many different stories. But the good news is this, and I promise you guys, not only does God know our stories, but he wants to do something about our stories. He wants to help us with our stories. As I suggested earlier, he knows the most wounded places of our stories. He knows the most broken places. He knows the darkest places. That's where he wants to bring his light. He knows the places of bondage and captivity. That's where he wants to bring his freedom. He knows the places of torment, you see, and the places of deep, deep shame in our stories, the things that we've done that we're horrified about ourselves, that we could ever do such a thing. God knows it all. And I'm advocating, you guys, I'm suggesting in this series of episodes, Understanding Your Story, that God wants to do something in the story of your life. God wants to journey with you into the stories of your life, to these wounded places, these dark places, these places of torment and captivity and bondage and pain and hurt. And God is going to do something amazing and remarkable in your stories. And so I close with the question, you guys, if this is true, if God was willing to take a journey with you into the stories of your life, would you be willing to take this journey with the living God. So I might just encourage you guys as we look forward to the next episode of this new series, Understanding Your Story. Just begin to pray about this, contemplate this, consider it, maybe begin to think and reflect on the landscape of your life, the stories of your life. If I ask you to begin to identify, what if I ask you to name the 10 most significant stories of your life? Which 10 stories would you pick? So just start thinking along the lines of this concept of story. And I think this is going to be a very exciting series of episodes. And I hope and I pray that God will use it in a powerful and significant way to bring forward His kingdom in our hearts and lives. The light of Christ, the healing of Christ, the truth of Christ, the redemption of Christ. So let me just say, guys, I'm so thankful that you're with me. Thanks for tuning into this episode, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys in our next episode. God bless you.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.